So before we actually move on, let's go ahead and kind of review what we did in part one. In part one, we were deciding how much weight to put in it, actually calculating how much weight to put in your lure, depending on the size of your lure and what you were trying to accomplish with the weight. We had a couple of techniques. One was the submersion technique, where we put the lure in water and weighed the change in the weight and did some minor calculations to get our maximum amount of weight that we wanted in it for it to be theoretically just barely suspending. We also used the material density technique, where we took a block of the material you're going to use, in this case wood, measured the dimensions of that block, multiplied those dimensions together to get the volume of that block, and then we weighed the block, and then you take that weight and divide it by the volume to get your density in grams per cubic centimeter. Now that brings up a little bit of a goof up that I made. In the edit, I actually cut that part out, and a couple of people noticed the missing step. And yeah, there was a missing step. After you weigh your block of wood, you take that weight and make that division. So sorry about that goof up. It was something I cut out in edit and didn't mean to. The other questions I was getting was about the lure that I ended up using to demonstrate all this stuff. And this lure I actually made specifically for this video, and I manipulated the weight of the lure and therefore the density of the lure specifically so that the math would come out really even and I wouldn't have to carry a bunch of decimal points and confuse everybody. And if you follow those techniques and those steps the way I did them, your results should be at least as good. And if you haven't seen part one, you should probably go ahead and watch part one before we move on to the information we're going to cover in part two, because this topic sort of builds on itself. So I'll go ahead and put a link up here somewhere. Go check it out. So in part two, we're going to go ahead and cover where to put the weight that you already know you need to put in there. And it's going to be dependent on what kind of lure it is, whether it's a lipped crankbait, a lipless crankbait, topwater lure, a swim bait, a segmented swim bait, or just a twitch bait or stick bait. And we're going to do that by knowing where the center of gravity is, having some sort of concept or idea of where the center of drag might be, and then also developing some rules of thumb on where the center of rotation might be on your lipped crankbaits. So for this technique, you're going to have to set up a little level line with a plumb line coming off of it at a T. And if you don't have a dry erase board, you should probably get one. But you can actually do this on any wall if you don't mind marring it. Or you can just use a cork board with a piece of paper on it. That works just fine. And for the demonstration, I'm going to use this little mouse lure that I'm working on. It's a little wake bait, and I'll have to put the bib in there to find the center of gravity, because you want to have the entire system in place, including the hooks. Now I'm going to go ahead and not have the tail on, but I'm not too worried about the tail because it's going to be made out of a soft plastic, and that's kind of neutral in the water. So the first thing I want to do is create like a little fin of masking tape on the top, and I want it pretty close to the center of the top of the lure, kind of like that, and then make sure the tape is kind of taped on itself, so it kind of creates like a little fin. And then using something really sharp, you can use a push pin or whatever you have. I'm going to just make a bunch of holes about 1/8 of an inch apart all the way across this fin. On most lures you can kind of eyeball where that center of gravity is going to be and make this much shorter, but I just want to make sure that you guys get the idea, and they don't have to be in a perfectly straight line or anything. And that should do it. Let's move on to the next step. And as I was saying, you really need to have anything that's going to add weight to it on the lure before you do this test. I've put this little aluminum bib that I plan to use on this thing. And I'm also going to go ahead and hang the hooks off the hook hangers, just temporarily. And you want to hang the lure from the intersection of the level line and the plumb line. And to hang it, I'm using just a little magnetic pin that sticks on my board. And I'll just take an educated guess of where the center of gravity might be and poke it through one of the holes. And darn it if I didn't get it just right. That's pretty close. It's actually a little bit head down. Let me move it just one notch over. So since it's head down, I'm going to move it towards the head one little notch, and we'll try it again. And I think that's perfect right there. So the next step is really to simply mark right on the belly, right where that line crosses. And I do that with as much precision as I can to try to get it on the center of that line. And sorry about the glare on this thing. All right, now that's about as perfect as I think I need to get it. So what this means is that this center line is marking the location of where the center of gravity is with everything on here, and where I want to put my weight if I want to keep the attitude of this lure the same in the water. And that would be where I put my weight. Now if I want the lure to be tail heavy, I move my hanging pin forward, make sure I put it back right in the middle of that vertical line, and now I can just reach down in here and mark where the vertical line crosses the body again, and so the back line marks the location of the weight for the lure to be tail down. And of course, if you want it to be head down, you just move the pin back and mark that location, which is going to be just slightly forward of everything. So now you have a nice, easy, dry technique to find the center of gravity and to find where to put your weight if you don't want it right perfectly level on the center of gravity. Now this can be done in a wet technique, which is basically taking some water, putting your lure in it, and then moving weight around until it floats the way you want it to float. But that technique has some limitations. One is that you have to have your lure perfectly sealed. Two is that if your lure is a sinking lure, you can't use that technique. You can only use this technique. And yeah, it does matter if your lure is a sinking lure, because most of us want our lures to sink at a certain attitude, whether nice and horizontal, or head first so it looks natural, or tail first so it looks like that fish or bait is in some sort of distress. So depending on how you're designing your lure, I think this is probably the simplest, easiest technique that I've come up with. So now we're experts at finding the center of gravity. Now let's talk about the center of drag, because really you probably don't hear anything about center of drag from any other lure maker. And that's because as an engineer, I'm a bit of a nerd. Why would the center of drag matter? Well, the center of drag and the center of gravity and their relative location to each other is what causes the lure to either change directions or hold the same direction. And this is really more important with topwater lures, whether it's a glide bait or a walk the dog bait. You want to make sure that those two are arranged in the proper location. Now, if you want your lure to walk the dog, you want to have the center of gravity behind the center of drag. And I made this little topwater lure as a test lure to demonstrate that topic. And I did that by embedding a weight in this that can shift back or forward by just pulling on these little tabs. So to get this lure to walk the dog, you slide the weight to the back. Little tempo gets it to walk the dog real easily. And for it to glide, you slide the weight forward. And if you're wondering why that is the case, imagine your lure is a dart. Darts are very nose heavy, right? All the weight is in the front. And the fletches on the dart really are the draggiest part of the dart. Everything else is super streamlined. When I throw the dart point first, it flies without changing any direction. But if I were to throw it fletch first, in other words, the center of drag forward of the center of gravity, the dart will actually rotate around in flight. The same thing happens with this. You give it a twitch, because of inertia, the mass in the back of the lure wants to keep moving as the drag in the front wants to slow it down, and the lure starts to turn. You twitch it again, and it'll turn the other direction. That's why you'll see a lot of lures that are walk the dog lures be tail down. But as I've shown you in a few builds, you can manipulate a lure to float perfectly level and still walk the dog really well by playing around with the center of drag and the center of gravity. Now the problem with finding the center of drag is that there's no real easy way to do it. But by knowing a few concepts about the shape of a lure, you can sort of intuit whether the center of drag is forward or back. If your lure is really perfectly streamlined, it's going to have very little drag. And that drag is going to be somewhere about a third of the way back from the nose, which makes it really difficult to add weight behind it without having that tail go down. So the trick is to ruin the streamlining a little bit by having the nose sort of dive down into a point much quicker and having the transition be a little more abrupt. So this way the water flowing across here goes into turbulence pretty quickly and your drag moves forward somewhere around 20 to 25% back from the nose. At that point, you can add weight here, keep the lure relatively level, and still get a walk the dog action. Or you can get a little bit tricky with your design and do something that adds a little extra drag way up ahead, like having these big bug eyes on this lure. And this lure really walks the dog great. And you can see it does come to a pretty good abrupt point along with having those eyes be kind of sticking out, causing a lot of drag forward. So that works great for having a walk the dog action. But if you want a gliding action, you have to do the reverse. You want your center of gravity forward of the center of drag, just like a dart. So when you give the lure a nice twitch, it'll glide forward, usually in a nice big arc. So for glide baits, it's really good to have a nice streamlined, very torpedo looking shape. And just to clarify, this applies not just to top water. It applies to subsurface lures as well. So you would manipulate the weight and center of drag the same way for a subsurface lure, depending on whether you wanted it to glide or you want it to twitch around a lot more erratically, or even walk the dog nice and neatly. Alright, so let's talk about crankbaits. Putting weight in the crankbait really is the art of trying to affect the lure as little as possible with the weight. Even though the weight will actually cause very little difference in action, it can inhibit the action if you really want a big action out of it. So the trick is to place the weight at a point where if you had an imaginary line going through the lure, that would be the point where it turns, sort of a hinge pin on the lure. So that's where you would want to place the weight. It means the inertia of the weight won't affect the lure's action at all. And while pinpointing that exact location where it's going to rotate is almost impossible, I have a couple of really good rules of thumb that have worked really well for me. Now that said, you can't do a whole lot with weight to solve any of your problems if you've got problems with the lure. Now I've had people contact me and ask for help on sort of resolving problems with crankbaits that don't want to pull straight, want to rotate or spiral or whatever. And most of the time, the problem is going to be with the alignment of the bib. Check to make sure that bib is nice and square and nicely aligned, because that bib has an enormous amount of hydrodynamic authority over the action of the lure. A lot more authority than any weight you could possibly put in it, in any location. The other thing you need to do is play around with your tie-on-eye location and play around with the tuning. And I made a video on tuning crankbaits, and I'll put a link right here. Go through that and see if that helps you. All right, let me show you how I estimate the location of rotation. So the first scenario is very much like this one, where the tie-on-eye actually overhangs the bib, but isn't actually on the bib. So in this situation, you want to measure from your tie-on-eye out to the end of your bib, and then take that measurement from the tie-on-eye into the lure, and that would be your center of rotation. So you'd want to put your weight on this line, and typically as low as you can put it. Now, if the amount of weight you need is more than that will fit there, then try to split it up so you'll have reasonably equal weight both sides of the line. Now, if your tie-on-eye is on the bib, the process is basically the same. You measure from your tie-on-eye to the end of the bib, and then there's a slight difference on this one. You measure in from the point of connection of your bib to find the center of rotation. This has always worked really well for me. Now, the third scenario is something you'll see on sort of stick baits, so old school crankbaits that typically have a really narrow shape like a minnow. And I made a lure like this a while back. I'll show you some pictures of it. And that's actually where the bib is actually far enough back on the body that the tie-on point actually overhangs it and is beyond it. And for this one, you want to measure from the tie-on point to the root of the bib, right where it connects to the body, and then take that same distance back into the body, and that would be where you would place the weight. So when you balance a lure the way I'm describing, typically you're going to end up with a lure that's a head down kind of lure. And this is a suspending lure, so it's a little odd, but it's really typical of a lure that you buy straight out of the store. They usually are head down and usually will float tail up pretty strongly. And in fact, this one's a little more of a classic. And you can see it's pretty much head down and has a strong tendency to float. Now that doesn't mean you can't weight and balance your lure to be perfectly horizontal or even to float head up. I actually designed a lure, and it took me a little while to make it, but it was head up, kind of tail down kind of lure, and when you stop the lure at the bottom of its dive and let it go, it would come up and just swim upward just like you were cranking it. It was a pretty cool lure. I never made a mold for it, and I lost it a long time ago, but I probably need to make another one. Time to talk about lipless crankbaits. Alright, well, lipless crankbaits can be really simple to make, but sometimes they can fool you and you can get the weight and balance a little off. But the rules of thumb are pretty simple. The typical design calls for the weight to be far forward, definitely in front of the center of gravity, but more often than not in front of the tie-on-eye, somewhere out here. And most people like the weight low and forward. Now that's a little bit of a sticky argument. I like to put mine forward, but closer to the center line of the lure. And that's because that's really close to the center of rotation on the action of a typical lipless crankbait. So they're traveling through the water nose down and rotating like this. So placing the weight closer to what I believe would be the center of rotation does the same thing for you as it does for the lipped crankbait, which is it kind of keeps the weight from inhibiting the action. But putting it low works just fine. That's what most lures have. Now, because the action on this lure really depends more on the retrieval rate than sort of internal dynamics of the lure, you can make a lure like this out of a material that doesn't float at all. Which typically on most lures, what you want is to start with a buoyant material like we talked about in the first episode, and then work your way with weight and balance to get the action and the stability in the lure. This is not the kind of lure you sort of twitch and pause. This is the kind of lure you either crank or you yo-yo back. And even though your typical commercial lure sinks quick, you can tell the tail is floating up. This has almost no flotation to it at all. It's got an air cavity in it, and its ballast weight is the ball bearings in here. And you can see it drops almost perfectly horizontal. And this big trolling lipless crankbait acts exactly the same. It's made from wood and it's slightly buoyant towards the tail. Now lots of folks make lures in this general shape, and typically because they'll either troll them or do a steady retrieve with them. They might even use them as twitch baits, but typically what they're after, what I usually am after on this shape, is a retrieve that gives me a sort of a serpentine movement through the water. Having the lure have a deep cutout near the belly gives you the turbulence near the tail that allows for that. But if it isn't weighted correctly, it might not do it. In fact, the combination of the right location of the tie-on-eye and the weight is what gives you a nice, steady, and stable retrieve with a lure like this. Typically what I like to do with this kind of lure is to have my weight as low as possible. I'll either put it right on the center of gravity or just slightly behind it. And it's the kind of lure that I like to have to be a very slow sinking lure. And it'll give me a retrieve that gives me a nice serpentine movement, and if I want to, I can give it a sweeping action with my rod tip and it will actually swim pretty aggressively, and it puts out a nice thump as you retrieve it. It works really well, and this kind of weight arrangement for me has worked best. But if you weight it like this and you find that the lure wants to rotate, play with your tie-on-eye. Either lower it or raise it, depending on the shape of your lure. That usually will solve all those problems. But typically, this is how I weight it. The other way I weight it is to have it be perfectly horizontal in the water. That works pretty well too. And if you use a floating version of a swimming hardbait, then what I would do is err on the side of having your lure balance. So typically that means having your weight just slightly forward of the center of gravity so that your lure will sit nice and level on the water. And if you still have some issues with it not swimming straight or wanting to roll up, play around with that tie-on location. That usually solves the problem, either moving it slightly down or slightly up. And when we talk about narrow body kind of stick baits like this, and like this little sardine, what I recommend is that you go with the same sort of weight scenario that I described early about the topwater lures. If you want a lot of erratic action, move the weight back behind the center of drag. And if you want more gliding kind of action, then move it forward. That should give you what you want. Now, when it comes to segmented swim baits, the action is really going to come from a properly balanced lure. A lure with a nice shape, with nice free moving joints, and with the tie-on location in the right spot for that lure. But what I like to do as far as weight and balance to give me a really enhanced sort of odds to get this thing to swim well is to have weight in each one of these segments, and each one of the segments be balanced how I want it to be balanced. In other words, it's going to sink slow, and each one of the segments is slow sinking. And then if I want it slightly head heavy, I'll just add a little more weight to the very front or the next one to the front to have it sort of fall head first. Typically, I like it to fall nice and horizontal. And if you balance all of them separately, that's usually what you get. And when you have problems with segmented swim baits like these that maybe they don't want to swim, it's typically the location of the tie-on-eye. So if you're just designing a new one, go ahead and play with that location of that tie-on-eye. That's what makes the biggest difference in stability as you retrieve it. So that you end up with a lure that will crank back quick and still swim nice and stable, or you can slow roll it and it'll maintain a nice swimming action. I think I covered everything I wanted to cover, and I think I answered most of the questions out there. If you have additional questions or things you want clarified, maybe we can do it in a question of the week. I think part 1 of this masterclass was the best viewed masterclass I've ever done. So thank you for all those views and all the questions and comments. And just in case you're new to this channel, all these lures are lures that I made in videos, and you can get a lot of really good instructional stuff out of those videos as well. And speaking of these lures, I got to start clearing this board, and I'm not sure what to do. I've been trying to give them away as people come up to me who recognize me, and I give away a lure or two. But I'm thinking I'm going to need to replace this camera really soon, So maybe raising some funds through selling these guys would be a good idea. What do you guys think? I'm thinking about just doing an eBay store and having everybody just either bid on it or just set the price. Let me know what you guys think. What are you guys comfortable with? As you guys know, this is not a business for me. This is all out of pocket. And if you guys haven't seen any of the other master classes, I'll go ahead and put a link right here. There should be a box right here somewhere of a playlist with all the master classes in it. You should definitely go there and see what you've missed. And even if you've watched them already, maybe give them another view. I'm always surprised when I watch them myself that there's a lot of information in there. All right, guys, thanks again, and I'll see you on the next video.